tarde a todas e todos. Max, Patrícia. A Patrícia, ela é autora do livro A Máquina do Ódio, né? Muitos de vocês devem ter lido. E é um livro que fala sobre como grupos políticos usaram as big techs para espalhar inverdades, ódio, violência. Ela própria foi muito alvo e conta isso no livro. E o livro do Marx, A Máquina do Caos, essa coincidência de títulos, A Máquina do Caos mostra como as plataformas, percebendo esse espalhamento de ódio, de mentira, muitas vezes olham para aquilo e veem que isso vai ajudar a maximizar as métricas que são úteis para os objetivos da plataforma. Tempo de visualização, engajamento, compartilhamento. Então acho que a gente vai ter aqui uma boa troca aqui entre esse trio. Eu queria começar, Max, dizendo o seguinte. E eu vou fazer essa primeira pergunta, mas vocês sabem, o nome mais ouvido aqui hoje foi a Débora, né? Que é a pessoa que pega as perguntas. Então quem tiver perguntas ao longo da conversa vai marcando para a Débora. O teu livro ele tem 3 eixos ali de apuração que eu chamo como principais, que são testemunhas das Big Techs contando o que elas vivenciaram, fizeram e tudo mais. Você tem ali uma apuração de campo com o público, né, onde a vacina foi evitada, onde houve mortes, ataques e tudo mais. E você tem uma parte muito importante que é a parte científica. Para começo de conversa, eu acho que isso pode complementar em tudo que a gente está ouvindo nesse festival, que você contasse para a gente que aspectos de evolução e aspectos psicossociais de quem somos hoje e que são positivos, né, instintos positivos para a nossa sobrevivência, estão a serviço e acabam nos tornando vulneráveis para algumas estratégias de grupos mal intencionados.
It's a great question. I'm really glad you started with that, because when I first started looking at the effects of social media on the world, on us individually, the big question in my head was, okay, well, we can look at the platforms and we know they're toxic, we know they're unpleasant. We can look at the things that are happening in society and know that it doesn't look great. But how do you actually prove in a real scientific way that one leads to the other? And I, of course, was not alone in this. It turns out that there were a number of social scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists who are all kind of independently starting to look at the same question. What does social media do to us at an individual level, at a collective level? So I was really, I was the beneficiary of timing in that an enormous amount of research that all tends to point in a very consistent set of directions was coming out around the same time. And there are so very many things to say about it. I'll give you 3 kind of top line data points that were very helpful for me in understanding the very basics of the psychological, the social, the kind of the physical, the neurological impacts of social media and what that has to do with how it changes us. Number 1 is that the people in Silicon Valley, when they were first designing modern social media as we know it now, which really started around 2009, 2010, they were very deliberate in wanting to make it addictive. That was a word that they used very openly. They said, we want to mimic slot machines, we want to mimic substances that are addictive, we want to create a physical addiction in users so that they will come back to our platform, not because they think it provides a good service for them, not because it's a good source for news, although certainly we'll market it around those things, but because they have a physical compulsion and an addiction to do so. And there was this entire field of research in Silicon Valley that was very hot at the time about learning from slot machines and casinos. And if you look at your smartphone app, it looks like a slot machine, right? You get the bright flashing lights, you get the colors, you get it's called haptic feedback when your phone vibrates. And that's modeled explicitly off of a slot machine. And we know from neurological research that has been done much more recently that using social media does create a physical addiction in your brain, just like an addictive substance, that your brain really experiences it the same way that it experiences alcohol, drugs, nicotine, and that it releases, using the app, releases a big burst of dopamine. And it releases that burst of dopamine when you're trying to pursue something that is important to you, like a sense of social connection, or you want to know about the world. You get that hit of dopamine, and then eventually use the app enough time, it creates an addiction, which again, you can see in people's brains, just like a drug. And what do we know about drugs is that it also changes your cognition. It changes your behavior, it changes the way you think and feel. So think of that as kind of a baseline of, we know that social media changes the chemistry in your brain. Number two, I think about some of the research that was first starting to come out, the kind of most basic research in like 2015, 16, around when I started looking at social media and started taking it seriously, because I came to it late. Many people came to it, like Patricia, much earlier than I did, understanding its importance. And this study where these researchers took a really big group of people in the United States, and they said, we want all of you to deactivate Facebook for, I think it was 4 weeks. So just one platform, and just for 4 weeks, which is not very long. And they found that people in this study group who deactivated Facebook, relative to people who stayed on Facebook, that they reported much higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction, equivalent to a third of the effect of going to therapy, which is crazy. That's a huge effect, and also is so much cheaper than going to therapy, just shutting down an app. But it was also, it's evidence that people aren't using because it makes them happy, right? They're using it even though it makes them unhappy. But the thing that really stuck with me about this study is the people who shut down Facebook for 4 weeks became less polarized in their political attitudes, and the reduction in their level of polarization was equivalent to about half of the overall increase in political polarization in the United States from 1996 to 2018. So half of the polarization just from shutting down the app. That doesn't mean that Facebook was causing all of that polarization, but it just goes to show you that just being off of it for a short amount of time changes the way that you think about politics. Now, to actually answer your question about, okay, but how does it actually work on your brain? How does it actually producing these effects? There's one study that I love to bring up because it's narrow, but I think it shows how this works. And it has to do with moral outrage, which if you have been on Twitter, boy, have you seen some moral outrage. And outrage is different from anger in that it's not just expressing that you're upset or you're angry at someone. It's expressing that you are angry at someone for transgressing a social norm, for transgressing against the community, you know, doing something that politically inappropriate or, you know, using a bad word, something like that, and that you're angry on behalf of your community against this transgression. So this study took a big group of people and they had them use a fake version of Twitter. It was fake so that they could control the experience. And they tested before the experiment everyone's innate predisposition to outrage. Like, how likely were they as a person to feel or experience moral outrage? And then regardless of whether, you know, they are someone who tended towards outrage or didn't tend towards outrage, they had all of these people, as they were using this fake Twitter machine, they at one point told them, hey, send a tweet with a moral outrage expression in it, even if they didn't want to. They said, just send a tweet, see what happens. And then they would show those users that tweet with a really high engagement numbers on it, you know, lots of retweets and shares and likes. And we know that this is something that would happen because we know from other research into not just Twitter, but all of the social platforms, that they all really exaggerate the reach of any post that has moral outrage in it. If you tweet something with moral outrage, the algorithm that determines what people see on the platform will make sure that many, many more people see it in order to get them to interact with it, because the platforms have learned that moral outrage creates more engagement, creates more time on the platform. So we know that if you send a tweet with outrage, you're going to see more engagement numbers. So that's what they showed to the people in this study. And they did this a few times. And what they found very quickly is that the people in this study, regardless of whether or not they tended towards outrage before the study, all of a sudden really wanted to send a lot of outraged tweets, because that sense of social reward, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, that sense of social reward from getting all the likes and shares, even though it was fake, feels so powerful. And that sense that the community likes it when you act this way. Your community rewards this behavior. It's so effective, and that's so important to all of us psychologically, that we internalize that. And the thing that we did that gets that psychological reward, we want to repeat it. And the thing that really blows my mind about this study is that those people in that experiment who became likelier to send an outrage tweet also became likelier to express moral outrage and to feel outraged even when they were not using Twitter. So just this experiment, just seeing their fake tweets with little numbers below it saying you got a lot of retweets, changed their internal nature and changed their predisposition to how they behave because of how effective social platforms are at delivering this social reward that is so effective at driving our behavior and how we think. And when you start to look at all of the kinds of behaviors that social media rewards and the things that incentivizes and encourages, you can start to see how that training, because that's what it is, it's being, trained like any pet, can start to have an effect on who you are.
E tem aspectos evolutivos que mostram como chegamos até aqui, né? Por que temos esse comportamento? E queria que você comentasse um pouco também, é um aspecto do seu livro muito interessante ali, mostra como a chegada da linguagem, as mudanças físicas do ser humano nos trazem até esse ponto.
So you want to hear about the foxes, right?
Sim, essa história das raposas é muito boa.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a story from the book that I loved. I thought it was so fascinating. People really responded to. I should warn people, it's initially going to sound like a story about a bunch of foxes in the Soviet Union, and it is, but it does eventually become a story about human nature and social media, but it has to do with, like you're saying, where our nature comes from and how the development of language changed who we are that created these innate tendencies that social media brings out. Okay, so the foxes. So there was this theory in genetics going back to Charles Darwin that remained unsolved for like 100 years, or unproven, I should say, that said that domestication of animals, right? So like a dog versus a wild dog, or a pet dog versus a wild dog, that was genetic. That wasn't just something where it was a different breed, it wasn't just behavioral, that there was something genetically, physically that changes in animals when that breed becomes domesticated. And there was this scientist, this geneticist in the Soviet Union in the 1950s who finally wanted to prove this theory, because all domesticated animals, whether they're dogs, horses, cats, cows, they all have a particular set of physical traits in common. They all have floppy ears, they all have white spots on their head, or they often have white spots on their heads. They tend to be smaller than their wild counterparts. There's a few things like that all led people to think it's genetic, it's physical, but then no one knew, okay, how did that happen? What are the triggers for it? So she set up this lab in the middle of nowhere in Siberia to breed foxes to see if she could reproduce domestication in a wild animal. And the reason she did it in the middle of nowhere in Siberia was not relevant for social media, but I just think it's a fun story, was that Stalin had outlawed the study of genetics. He considered it like a Western capitalist invention. I'm not sure why he was so upset about genetics. So she had to do it in secret. So she was operating out of this fox farm, secretly running this genetics test that she thought would take, 50 years, where she would have to breed one generation of foxes after another to see if she could get them to spontaneously domesticate. And this would prove, if she could do it by breeding, that it was genetic. And so she started with a bunch of foxes, and they would pick the friendliest 10% of each generation of foxes, and then they would have those breed, and then the rest, unfortunately, got made into fur, RIP. But those 10% that were friendliest would get to breed the next generation, and then she would pick the 10% friendliest of those, because this is her theory, is that friendliness, just how welcoming the animal was to the humans, how likely it was to come up to them, would eventually lead to domestication. And she thought this was going to take 50 years, but it took I think 6 or 7 years. Almost immediately, not only did the foxes start to behave like domesticated animals, but they suddenly had floppy ears, they suddenly had the white spots on their foreheads, they were smaller, all of these physical changes. So the fact that she had isolated it allowed her to then test, okay, physically what changed in the foxes? What was the thing at a genetic level that happened to lead to this? And she discovered that it was this kind of stem cell called a neural crest cell that was being inhibited when the fox was, I think, just a baby or maybe hadn't even been born yet. And that was why the white spot didn't show up, as this cell that led to, among other things, the development of the white spot, or that led to pigment in the forehead was getting inhibited. But one of the things that this cell did was it developed the parts of the brain that drive aggression. And the kind of hormones that produce aggression. So suddenly the foxes weren't getting this. They weren't aggressive anymore, which is very bad if you're a wild fox, but great if you're a domesticated animal. So this was a big breakthrough because it proved domestication and because it turned out that do you know where that same mutation shows up, but in human beings? And this also proved this theory that human beings were domesticated. But then this raised another big question, which is, and I swear to you, this will come back to social media. How did human beings domesticate, right? Because it's not like 100,000 years ago. I think that number is right. No, it's more than that. It's a very big number. Many, many, many years ago. It's not like there was some Soviet geneticist who was picking out the friendliest people and saying, you know, you guys go behind this bush and create some friendlier people. So how did it happen? And this led to a second breakthrough by an English anthropologist and geneticist who figured out, or he kind of worked backwards and deduced, and the way he got to this is very interesting, it's very complicated, and I do want to bring it back to social media soon enough, that what had happened was that language had developed among early humans, and that when language had developed, the structure of societies among humans had suddenly changed overnight, where before that, and you still see this in most other primates, you still see in great apes, that these societies were vertical, that there was an alpha, and that the alpha was kind of in charge, and that it was a strongly led society and often very violent, and that when language was developed around the same time, that suddenly, according to kind of fossil records and what they deduced about how these societies work, they became horizontal. All of a sudden, it was communal, decisions were made collectively, and you still see that now in pre-agrarian societies, is that there might be a leader, but there tends to be a lot of decision-making by consensus. It's consensus among men, but there tends to be a lot of cooperation, flat hierarchies. And what he figured out, because again, you see this still in pre-agrarian societies, is that the governing mechanism changed with language from the strongest, toughest person is in charge to the community collectively enforces social norms. That everybody kind of informally agrees, and of course we still do this, to the right way to behave, the wrong way to behave, and if you behave the wrong way, you know, what we will do is we'll shun you, right? Or we'll send you to jail, or there'll be some kind of punishment, or we'll just say, you know, hey, don't do that. But the way that it works often in pre-agrarian societies is that people who transgress social norms are ejected from the community, which means they die, which means they don't reproduce. So this was the mechanism that led to domestication, because all of a sudden, these ancient, you know, many million years old human societies were themselves selecting for the people who are better at cooperating, people who are friendlier, and the people who observe social norms get kicked out. And those are the people who stay, and those are the people who reproduce and pass on their genes. But the mechanism by which people are kicked out is often very violent, and is often, and we've all seen this, if someone does something really bad, everybody gets upset, right? So we developed this instinct to enforce social norms called moral outrage, where someone transgresses the community, someone does something bad, it triggers something in our brain that makes us want to rally the entire community against them, and it makes us want to punish them. And we've become, in kind of contemporary society, pretty good at controlling this impulse. You still see, you know, mobs are still a thing that happens, and we all know about mob mentality, right? A bunch of people get together, everybody is outraged, suddenly they're capable of anything. But we still feel this tremendous capacity for violence and for hate and for aggression that comes out when this moral outrage that was the thing that guided our domestication, just like the Soviet geneticist guided the fox's domestication, because it is so deeply ingrained in us. And what these social media platforms learned is they learned what is the thing that is going to make us the most active on the platform, that will make us spend the most time on it, that will make us post to it as much as possible, and post to it in a way that people who read our posts will also themselves spend a lot of time on the platforms and will themselves become really active on it. Well, it's triggering this sense of not just I'm feeling moral outrage, but I'm acting on it. I'm going to go out and I'm going to get this person who did the wrong thing. And sometimes moral outrage can be a force for good in our society, right? There's social movements pushing back against abuse, pushing back against misogyny, against racism. That's moral outrage. But when the platforms learned that they can get us to spend a lot of time in there by delivering the strongest triggers for moral outrage as possible, all of a sudden it starts creating this atmosphere on social media that is so powerful that it changes the user's internal nature, right? Like that study we were talking about, to make them feel more moral outraged, more desirous of acting on it, of finding someone who is transgressing and going out and punishing them, angrier and more possessed of a mindset of us versus them, of I have to rally the people in my in-group against the transgressors, against the out-group, against the people who I don't like, and we're going to have to go out and punish them. And that is why you see people on social media not just very outraged, but really driven by this sense of us versus them.
E por isso, por isso o post vacine-se, que não tem nada de muito polêmico, vai ter muito menos engajamento do que algo por trás das vacinas, né? Patrícia.
Bom, queria primeiro agradecer, Daniel, pela generosidade do merchan do livro e fazer um merchan do livro do Max Fischer. Vocês precisam ler, é espetacular. Tendo dito isso, o teu livro prova inúmeras vezes como as plataformas sabiam desde cedo de que elas estavam causando esse tipo de ultrapolarização, só que isso é do interesse delas, porque isso mantém o engajamento, e quanto mais tempo você tiver os usuários engajados, mais dinheiro você ganha, mais dados você extrai, etc, etc. A Maria Ressa, que ganhou o Prêmio Nobel, uma jornalista, ela costuma dizer que fazer moderação de conteúdo, ou seja, sair pedindo para remover linguagem de ódio, incitação a golpe de Estado, isso é enxugar gelo. Que enquanto você não mudar o incentivo do modelo de negócio das plataformas, enquanto for lucrativo você manter as pessoas com o moral outrage, as pessoas ali engajadas, isso não vai mudar. Tendo dito isso, que tipo de regulação você acha que seria necessária e se alguma regulação conseguiria fazer? Como lidar com isso?
That's a really good point. I think you're absolutely right that moderation is, not only is it insufficient to solve the problems, because like you said, it's the platforms are creating the problems. It's all of the incentives in the platforms that promote misinformation, that promote hate speech. And so if you just have some moderators who occasionally remove some posts, that's not going to fix it. And I think it's also part of the problem politically, because the companies that run the social platforms have learned to use moderation as an excuse and as a fig leaf. And they say, oh, well, we'll hire more moderators, or, you know, your government should really write us better rules for what posts to take down, what posts to leave up. And it's a way to deflect attention and deflect responsibility away from the technology itself and away from the way that the platforms behave. And I think that Race is exactly right about moderation is not only ineffective, but focusing on it is ineffective. And you saw EU regulations early on really focused on setting tougher rules for what the regulators or what the moderators should remove, and we have to have more moderators. And that's a good thing to do, because early on, a lot of the platforms, especially in very poor countries like India, where I know you've reported, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, they would just not have moderators, and that was really, really bad and really dangerous. But I think there is a sense now among people who I talk to who are really smart on the platforms. A lot of these people used to work at the companies themselves. They're not dogmatic anti-technology people. They love technology, they love Silicon Valley, but they all say that any effective regulation has to focus on changing the nature of how the platforms work, or making it harder for people to get on the platforms at all, or making it, not in the sense of forbidding it, but in the sense of forbidding kids from using it, which is the law in a lot of countries, but is not observed by the companies at all. There are huge numbers of kids, and that's very bad because the effects on children are much higher. It's much easier for them to get addicted. So there's some energy around saying, you know, like we did with cigarettes, we have to make it tougher for kids to use it, tougher for people who are vulnerable to use it, and we have to be more effective at warning people that it's going to be harmful for you. Or there's a school of thought that says we can make social media beneficial. And I think there was a time before 2009, if you were on social media in the 2000s, like, it could have some toxicity, but it didn't have all this bad stuff from the algorithms promoting all these terrible things. And at some point, if you are going to make social media healthier, I think it has to be, you're only going to be able to do it through regulations that force the company to change their business model away from maximizing regulation at all costs. And I don't know how you achieve that, because these companies are huge and they're very powerful. and they have become really aggressive at fighting back against governments. But I know at least in the United States, that is increasingly where a lot of the discussion is focused among regulators.
Uhum. E só pegando um gancho que você estava falando, que era muito cômodo para as plataformas dizerem, então façam aí uma regulação para a gente saber o que a gente remove, etc. Teve também uma época que as plataformas sempre respondiam falando, a gente está investindo em educação midiática. Estamos gastando milhões em educação midiática para as pessoas saberem diferenciar desinformação, de informação, etc. E agora, recentemente, teve vários estudos mostrando que existe um limite para a eficiência da educação midiática, né? Queria, assim, com todos esses especialistas que você falou, até que medida as pessoas compartilham uma desinformação por ignorância, porque elas não sabem que aquilo é falso, ou porque elas não diferenciam opinião de informação, ou elas simplesmente, não é um caso de educação midiática, elas vão continuar fazendo isso?
You're absolutely right. It's a very good distinction to draw because it is very easy to think of, and I think this was the prevailing view a lot of people had early on in the social media era. It's very easy to think that the problem is other people who aren't smart enough to use social media. And it's easy to think, well, I'm smart and I went to university and I know about social media, so I would never fall victim to social media's harms. But I've been on it and nobody is immune to it. And there's no level of media literacy classes that will remove its effect on your mind and that will make you immune from spreading misinformation, which, like right now in the war with Israel and Gaza, there's misinformation everywhere, disinformation everywhere. And there's so many people who are really smart, who are really intelligent and really well-meaning, who are falling victim to it because of the way that our minds work and the way that social media is built to exploit how our minds work. There's another study that I think about a lot that I think is a good example of this, where it was in 2018, I'm sorry to use another United States specific study, but it's the one I know. In 2018, there was a big refugee crisis at the southern United States border where there were very large numbers of Central American refugees and migrants showing up at the border. The Trump administration was very terrible to them, was very violent in preventing them from crossing. And it was very prevalent at the time on social media to have a lot of misinformation about the refugees and migrants saying, they're all criminals, or they're trying to sneak over for cartels, or the fake videos of them supposedly beating up police that were especially popular among conservative Americans who liked Donald Trump, so wanted to believe that the immigrants and refugees were bad. So this study tried to look at, okay, how do people think about this differently if they encounter this misinformation about the refugees and the migrants in the context of something that looks like a news article, where it's just the information is just presented to them, or the context of a social media post, right? So they would take the same sets of rumors and just package it different. It looks like a Facebook post, it looks like a news article. And what they found is that even people who had lower levels of education, who were very strongly conservative, so were politically inclined to believe it, if they read it in a newspaper or in the fake newspaper article, their critical thinking brain would kick in, and they would actually ask themselves, do I think this is true? And they had a much higher likelihood of identifying the story as false, as saying, I don't believe that, even though it was in their political incentives to believe it. And when it was presented to them, the exact same text in something that looked like a Facebook post, where there are comments beneath it, there's the like button, there's the share button, just that social context, the idea that it is presented as your community believes this. Everyone who you follow likes this story, they've commented approvingly on it, they're sharing it. That just triggered an entirely different part of their brain. And there's this whole school of thought, or this whole field of study about how your social brain and your thinking brain, they're just different. They just process differently. And people who processed it through this Facebook post were much likelier to believe it. And they were much likelier to say, I would share this information because I think that it's true, even though a lot of these people later, if they then looked at the news article, even having already said that it was true, would then go back and say, wait, actually, I think it's not true. So just this social context, and this has been shown many times with things like vaccine misinformation, where if you encounter it in a Facebook group, you are much likelier to believe it. It overwhelms the parts of our brain, our better judgment, our better nature, it's baked into the way that this information is presented to us. And that's before we even get to these social media algorithms that will deliberately promote the bad information over the good, because the algorithms have learned that is going to be more effective at getting people's attention.
Max, especificamente nos casos de Myanmar e do Sri Lanka, bom, Myanmar a gente tinha um caso em que a internet, houve uma abertura para a internet do dia para a noite, rapidamente ali grande parte da população passou a aderir às redes sociais, e inclusive nos planos de operadoras, como acontece muito no Brasil, muitas vezes ali eram gratuitos, né, não consumiam dados. Você na tua investigação, ouvindo tanto fontes das companhias, né, das Big Techs, quanto vítimas, né, pessoas em loco nesse país, em que houve ataques, né, de uma população contra a outra, com muitas mortes. No caso você chama até muita gente chama até de genocídio, no caso de Myanmar. Eu queria entender assim, exatamente a reação das Big Techs quando alertadas, porque você vai reconstruindo isso, né? Houve alertas ali, isso está acontecendo. Como foi esse passo a passo? E se você entendeu não só essas reações, mas entendeu o porquê dessas reações?
Yeah, the arrival of social media, predominantly Facebook, and Twitter to a lesser extent, YouTube to a lesser extent, predominantly Facebook in Myanmar, I think is a really revealing story, because like you said, before the country opened up, it had been under international isolation for a very long time. There was basically zero social media penetration. And I went there before that happened, and I went there after that happened, so I saw the transformation. And after it opened up, all of a sudden adoption went to like 50%, maybe it was 40%, which is very high for a country with such low smartphone and computer ownership rates. It's basically anyone who could be on it was on it. And initially, Silicon Valley was incredibly excited about this. I think it was Eric Schmidt, it was the former CEO of Google, went with Barack Obama when the country opened up to say, we're going to bring you freedom, good information. The advent of social media in your country will lock in your democracy and will really bring, liberation to you. So they at least were telling people, and I think earnestly believe, that this is not just another market. This is a place where we are going to really change society for the better. We're going to be this great force for good. But once social media became really prevalent, after it had been kind of entrenched enough for people to start using a lot, which they did because the apps were free to use for people in Myanmar, because they had 0 rating, which I know is also here for some social media apps, so you don't have to pay for the data. So immediately Facebook displaces every credible news source in Myanmar. They're completely pushed out of the market because you have to pay for a newspaper, Facebook is free. Very quickly what starts to happen is that these social media platforms are absolutely overrun with hate speech against the Rohingya minority, which is a Muslim minority that lives in the northwest part of the country. And there had been racism against Rohingya beforehand, but this is of a degree well beyond that. And there's some reasons that don't have to go with social media for why it got triggered, but everyone who was in the country at that time said, okay, well, you talk to people on the street, and then you look on social media, and on social media it's much more exaggerated, and there's much more hate and much more conspiracy theories. And immediately when this happened, an Australian guy, or no, was it Ayla Callan? I think it was an Irish woman who was in Myanmar working at a tech monitor, flew out to Silicon Valley because she was so alarmed by this. And she said, I don't know what you're doing in Myanmar. I don't know what your platform is doing, but it appears to be artificially promoting hate speech and racist conspiracies against this minority in this country that has a very new democracy, has a very new social order. It's very unstable. This is really dangerous. You have to do something. And she found out through the course of these discussions that they had exactly one moderator for the entire country. It's a big country. It's like 45 million people. One person.
Uma pessoa que falava aquela língua.
That's right. One person who spoke Burmese, which is one of many languages in Myanmar. So there were all sorts of minority languages that weren't getting moderated at all. And Facebook did nothing.
Mas ela foi recebida por pessoas de alto escalão? Você tem essa informação? Ela foi recebida de fato por pessoas que tinham poder ali de, pelo menos, fazer a mensagem chegar mais rápido em quem tomava a decisão?
Yes. Yeah. At that point, because Facebook's international expansion was a really big deal. So she was able to speak to senior executives about it. Oh, and something else. There's so many examples of these social media companies being irresponsible. Shortly after that, there was a huge riot in, oh God, I can't remember the name of the city. It was one of the, like a medium-sized city in Myanmar that had this big riot that was triggered by a Facebook post. There was an extremist guy, this extremist far-right monk, who posted just completely false information that said the Muslims in this town are raping the Buddhist women. It's a majority Buddhist country. And here are their names, here are their addresses, we have to get them. This post went viral, lots of other people posted, you know, let's get them, we have to go get them. There again is the moral outrage and the mob mentality. And this led to, you know, a bunch of stalls being burned down, a bunch of people were attacked, a bunch of homes were burned down, and the Myanmar government shut off access to Facebook in the city, and immediately the riot stopped, right, which is good proof of what was driving it. And when that happened, finally, all of a sudden, Facebook cares. Finally, all of a sudden, because throughout this, the Myanmar government was trying to reach Facebook to say, what's going on with your platform? Can you stop spreading this hate speech, please? And they were not responding, but they shut down traffic, and suddenly Facebook gets back to them and says, hey, why did you shut down our traffic? So that is an important story, I think, because it shows that Facebook knew, because they had to deal with the Myanmar government at a high level, they knew that their platform was inciting violence. And even after that, 2 more times, there was another guy, an Australian guy who ran a tech monitor in Myanmar, who flew to Facebook's headquarters twice in 2015 and 2016 to warn them again. And he brought data. He brought this big PowerPoint presentation showing them, here are all of these posts with all of this hate speech and incitement and conspiracy theories. First of all, these posts go against your platform's own rules. So why are you letting them be the most popular posts on the platform that have all of this really dangerous incitement on them? And second of all, the numbers on these posts are so huge that it is evidence, and a lot of people reach this conclusion, evidence that it would not be reaching this many people unless your algorithm was artificially promoting, was pushing it out to people, which of course would be entirely consistent with everything we know about how the algorithm works, because that's very effective engagement bait. And again, both times Facebook said, oh, we'll hire more moderators, we'll do something, and absolutely nothing changed on the platform. And about a year after that, a lot of this sentiment, as well as other things that were happening in the government with the military, led to one of the worst genocides in the 21st century. And even the UN, which was on the ground, concluded that Facebook had played what they called a determining role in sparking this genocide. That's the UN. They're pretty careful about this. And they also said that Facebook wouldn't give them any data. So Facebook, which cared so much about opening up Myanmar, bringing freedom and democracy to Myanmar, when the UN is on the ground trying to stop a genocide, Facebook won't even give them data.
Mas aí você tem a percepção assim, bom, por um lado tudo bem, né? Querem maximizar o máximo de alcance, ter os números, mas também ninguém quer ser responsável por algo tão grave. Qual que era o temor ali? Era de criar um precedente internacional? Você consegue enxergar ali o porquê dessa inação? Ou te parece que passou absolutamente batido? Alguém ouviu, não levou para frente e não se falou mais naquilo?
Yeah. So there were enough warnings that you have to conclude people in the company at least knew about the warnings. They're people in a senior leadership role, because we know who was in these meetings, we know how big of a deal this got. And even after the fact, after it happened, Mark Zuckerberg kind of mocked the idea that Facebook could be involved in a genocide. He was very dismissive of it. And a lot of people at the company who I have talked to were very dismissive of it after the fact. But it's a really big question, because you're right, who would want to be responsible for a genocide? Wouldn't you rather just slow down the platform? And also, Myanmar isn't worth that much as a market. I mean, the advertising that they're going to make in a country that poor is really small relative to the reputational cost of being accused by the United Nations of provoking a genocide. And I think there are a couple explanations that kind of work in parallel to each other and work together. One is that if they admit, and this is just my deducing their thinking, if they admit the Facebook algorithm, and this is true of any platform with any similar incident, played a role in something as big as the Myanmar genocide, that's bigger than just we have to set different policies for Myanmar, which they did eventually do. That says there is something core to this technology and how it works that is harmful. And that starts to implicate your business in countries like Brazil and the United States that are extremely lucrative, where they're making, tens of billions of dollars. And they don't want to admit that. They really cling to the idea that there's no evidence that social media artificially promotes these kinds of ideas over those kinds of ideas. It's just amplifying things that are there already. There's no evidence that social media can change who you are internally. Of course, we know now that their own internal researchers were telling them the same thing from the leaks by Frances Haugen. But they're saying that because they know if they start to admit that, then it's like the cigarette companies saying like, well, sure, our cigarettes caused cancer in Myanmar, but that, that doesn't mean that we have to make them healthier in the United States. They just don't want to be in that position. And I think the other thing is that, Silicon Valley in the 2000s and 2010s really believed that they were changing the world for the better. They really believed, they don't anymore, they really believed that they were bringing revolution. There was going to be a completely new order in the world. They were going to elevate us beyond the establishment gatekeepers to this new enlightened world of the mind and of total freedom and democracy. And the companies really sell this idea to their employees. And if you have spent, 5, 10, 20 years in this environment, drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, you really want to believe that the product you're working on is a force for good. And you certainly don't want to believe the product you're working on was involved in a genocide. So I think that on some level, they're human just like us. It's easier to believe, well, the UN is wrong. Or all of these researchers who all reach the exact same conclusion on our platforms, they're lying because they want media attention, which is what a lot of them believe now.
Max, como você detalha no seu livro, e você estava explicando para a gente, como está muito bem documentado o papel do Facebook no genocídio dos Rohingya em Myanmar. A gente teve 2 outros episódios muito, vamos dizer, fortes. 6 de janeiro de 2021, a invasão do Capitólio. A gente pode dizer que as redes sociais foram instrumentais para organizar aquilo, para galvanizar as pessoas que acreditavam que a eleição tinha sido roubada. E 2 anos depois, aqui no Brasil, 8 de janeiro de 2023, as redes sociais, de novo, foram instrumentalizadas por políticos e usadas para organizar esse tipo de movimento antidemocrático, né, de tentar. No ano que vem, os Estados Unidos têm eleições presidenciais. Muito provavelmente, o ex-presidente Trump vai estar concorrendo. As plataformas aprenderam alguma coisa? Porque, basicamente, a gente pode esperar que, se ele perder, ele vai falar que roubaram a eleição.
Did they learn a lesson? Sure. I think that it's a good question because in 2020, in the run-up to the United States election, less so here, as of course you know very well, in the run-up to the 2020 election, some of the platforms, especially Twitter before it was sold to Elon Musk, did make a number of changes to restrict bad information, even in some cases really change how the platform works in a really fundamental way. On Twitter, it was actually for a while in the United States, you could not retweet something without clicking through a couple of screens because they wanted to slow it down, and then they found, the company itself admitted this after the fact, or came out and said this after the fact, that doing that slowed the spread of misinformation, but it also reduced overall engagement on the platform. So of course they turned it back on. Even immediately after January 6th, when the companies came out and there was, oh my God, this is terrible, they also were very strident in saying, we've had enough of the media backlash. We had nothing to do with this. The lesson that they took was from 2016, the 2016 election. After the 2016 election, when there was the first big tech backlash in the United States, the platforms made a big show of doing a lot of hiring a lot of people to try to understand the spread of misinformation on the platforms. They said, we're going to make all these changes. We're going to be more responsible. And the lesson that they learned from that is we should have never done that, because it doesn't matter what we do. The media is just going to yell at us because they're all biased against us and they're all corrupt, which is a surprisingly widespread belief in Silicon Valley. And so we shouldn't have any protections at all. And I think you saw that after January 6th in the United States, where Adam Mosseri, who's now the head of Instagram and is someone who's very important in Silicon Valley and sets a lot of the trends for how the platforms work, he said, that's ridiculous. We had nothing to do with it, which of course they did. There's an enormous amount of research and watchdog groups that knew that something like this was going to be coming. and tracked very carefully the evidence of how the platforms promoted the conspiracy theories that led to January 6th. And he just said, we're not going to change anything because we think that we had nothing to do with it, and we think that the people who hate us will hate us no matter what, so, you know, screw you. And that really upset a lot of people in the Joe Biden administration who are at least making an attempt to be more aggressive about regulation. Will they be different in 2024? I don't think they believe they have a responsibility to at a political level. I think the question is just how far will they go in making a show of trying to do things so that people won't get too mad at them, because it's a real bunker mentality up there these days.
Ou seja, no máximo vai ser uma ação de relações públicas para dizer que estão tentando fazer alguma coisa. E a outra coisa que eu queria perguntar, você mencionou como tem essa mentalidade muito defensiva de achar, e tem um pouco de razão, assim, porque as plataformas mais transparentes são as mais estão mais sob escrutínio, né? Na verdade, você pode até pensar isso, mas assim, essa percepção de que a mídia é contra a plataforma, etc. No seu livro, você falou com várias fontes, em off, em on, e você é muito crítico às plataformas. Você teve algum tipo de retaliação? Qual foi a reação das plataformas? E até hoje, assim, o pessoal gosta de você? Como é que é?
Oh yes, my many friends in Silicon Valley. I mean, I didn't face anything that would elevate to the level of, you know, coercion or threats or anything like that. That's just not how they operate. And I think they also, even if they would be tempted to do that, I'm not saying they would do it otherwise. I think they knew that going after a reporter for a big American magazine would just backfire. Although there were cases in, I think it was 2018 and 2019, where it turned out that Facebook had hired this like dark arts PR firm to spread all of these malicious conspiracies and rumors about people who wanted to regulate the platforms and about reporters. Yes, right, yeah, right, a lot about Soros. No, what I faced was more YouTube especially being very, very aggressive in pushing back against stories that were exposing bad things on the platforms. And not surprising that a company will defend its commercial interests over the interests of its users, but this case was, it's a little upsetting, so I'm going to try to give a very light description of it. This case felt especially revealing to me. What I found was actually in Brazil and in the United States, YouTube's algorithm, and Instagram was just caught doing the exact same thing by the Wall Street Journal. YouTube's algorithm was taking innocent home videos of very young children that had been taken where they were in a swimsuit, or maybe they were in revealing clothing, or they were in pajamas, and videos that just a family had taken and posted on YouTube thinking that 5 other people in the family would see it. The algorithm had taken these videos and strung them all together and was showing them to people who had watched softcore pornography on the platforms, and it would lead them to them incrementally where it would show them softcore pornography, and then it would show them younger and younger women, and then suddenly it would start showing them kids. And so this was I know, it's very upsetting. So it was basically soft child pornography that the platforms had cultivated. And I thought, you know, YouTube and I have had our disagreements. We've had our fights. When I reported on medical misinformation in Brazil, they fought very hard to try to discredit the research. They tried very hard to discredit the researchers. With political influence, they tried very hard to stop the stories. Surely some level of basic human decency will bring them around. And initially, I did speak to someone at the company who said, you know, we don't agree with you that the algorithm did as much as you say that it did, but we take this seriously enough that we are going to stop recommending videos of children altogether, just to be safe. Our algorithm can tell if there's a little kid in the video. The algorithm will never promote these again, just to make sure it doesn't do this. And I thought, that's great. That's something where they are putting the well-being of human beings against their company's interests. And then I heard from the company the next day, and they said, well, we changed our mind. Because if we make that change, people who use YouTube will make less money. And what that means is that also YouTube will make less money. And they also tried very hard to discredit the research, to slow the story down. So that was for me a big revealing episode. And many reporters have had similar experiences with companies generally, and YouTube in particular, finding them very hostile to this kind of work.
Max, o João Santino pergunta sobre TikTok. Como é que você vê essas plataformas chinesas, né? No Brasil a gente tem o Kawaii também, que é bastante popular, e o TikTok virou um gigante no mundo todo. Como é que você vê? Tem alguma particularidade? Você acha que são problemas semelhantes?
I think the problems are pretty similar. The fact that it's Chinese-owned really doesn't worry me too much. I mean, I think if you are a senior government official, you probably shouldn't have it on your phone. Every security researcher who's looked at it says TikTok is a privacy nightmare, but so is Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. So it's kind of just as bad. It's just, do you mind more if your data is in the hands of, Silicon Valley executives in California or the Chinese government? I do think that TikTok, it behaves very much the same way. Its algorithm has arrived at just the same conclusions as all the other ones, but it is a much more extreme version of it. And that's not because it's Chinese owned, it's just because it is algorithmically dominated in a way that even very algorithmic platforms like Instagram and YouTube really are not. And I think that's why, even though we are just at the beginning of understanding how TikTok works, it's very opaque, it's very hard to study. What we are learning so far, and anecdotally, suggests that it is worse than any of the other platforms. I spent, as kind of an experiment, because there was so much discussion in the United States of how TikTok presents the Israel-Gaza war. I spent a couple of weeks on it where I was following the major news, both from the kind of quote-unquote pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian perspectives, just checking the different hashtags and following it. And I didn't find that it was biased in one direction or another, as far as I could tell, but the level of disinformation and misinformation on it was so far beyond anything I'd seen on any platform, on any issue, that it really scared me, because this platform is incredibly dominant with young people who, because they are adopting it so young, are learning to use it for everything to the exclusion of, reading a newspaper.
Yeah, we know that. Você falou uma coisa agora, só pegando o gancho, num episódio recente de podcast da Crooked Media, você fez um comentário sobre o último relatório de notícias digitais da Reuters, que eles fazem todo ano, mostrando que pela primeira vez as pessoas usam mais criadores de conteúdo na internet do que sites noticiosos como fonte de notícias. Então, assim, elas vão usar mais o TikTok, o YouTube, do que o site da Piauí, o site da Folha. O que isso representa para o mundo e para o jornalismo?
So the caveat that I should give, to be fair to people on TikTok, is that I don't think it's anything close to the majority of the predominant thing that you will see on it, but there are people who are doing real journalistic work with it, and you will see, young Palestinians in Gaza who are using TikTok and using their phone to show people at the ground level what's happening there in a way that is incredibly impactful and incredibly important. So I don't want to minimize or dismiss that work that is happening there, but I think that overall the effect is really negative and really scary, because, part of it is just that if it's influencers, even if it's an influencer whose heart is in the right place, they don't have the same resources, they don't have the same background, and they don't have the same financial incentives as a news agency whose incentives are all about creating a reputation for credible information. It's all about, trying to provide the most, or trying to provide an objective version of the story, for readers that will be helpful for them. The incentives for TikTok creators are all about just cruising the algorithm. It's all about what's the dominant hashtag today, and then if you want to be at the top of that hashtag, and if you want to be at the top of people who were scrolling posts about the war Israel-Gaza, what are the first things you're going to see? The thing that will get you to the top of that feed is expressing outrage, of course, and is telling the most extreme story that you can about the other side is bad and irredeemable. And I'm not saying there are not reasons to be outraged about what's happening. Of course, there are many. But if you actually look at what is the type of content that this creates, it's not this happened in the conflict, here's why it's happened, and here's why it's outrageous. What happens is all of the people of this demographic background, whether it's nationality, race, religion, they're all monsters. They're all terrible. I'm the only one who is going to tell you the truth. And especially what you hear a lot of them emphasize is don't trust the mainstream media because they won't tell you the truth. Only come to me, the TikTok influencer. I'm the only source of truth that you can come to because that's the incentive that the platform promotes. So even if you were trying to be someone on TikTok who is good, the platform will punish you for that. It will downrank you. You won't reach as many people. It's the things that will build the engagement that they really reward. And if you talk to younger people who get their news from TikTok, their understanding of what's happening is, in my experience, not very close to the truth, and especially their feeling of outrage and hatred towards not just what, say, the Israeli government is doing, but all Israelis is really extreme, and their hatred of the media, which I don't like because I work for the media, I think I'm pretty nice, is really intensive, and that trains them to say never read the newspaper, never watch the news because it won't tell you the truth, unlike TikTok.
Triste.
Yes. Yeah.
Max, e a Bruna pergunta, ela fala o seguinte: hoje as mídias sociais são necessárias para a nossa vida social e profissional. Tem algum jeito, né, como usuário, de sermos menos afetados por esse uso, que não seja usá-las menos? E aí ela pergunta do ponto de vista individual e também aproveita para perguntar do ponto de vista das próprias plataformas, assim, de regulação. Tem como essas plataformas continuarem nos dando o que elas têm de bom, mas minimizando os problemas?
Let me answer the regulation question first, because that's a shorter one. They can, in theory. It's entirely technically possible to build a social media platform that has way less of the bad and way more of the good, because we know what causes it. It's promotional algorithms, it's things like the share button, the like button, and even Jack Dorsey, when he was the head of Twitter, used to say, we should maybe not have a share button. We should maybe not have a like counter at the bottom of posts because we know the incentives that's created are terrible, but if I remove it, that'll drop engagement and then my shareholders will come after me, because these are all publicly traded companies. And we know that they're not going to do this on their own, at least to the extent that would be necessary to fix the problem, because it cuts so hard against their financial incentives, which means any executive who did this would be immediately ousted by the board of their company, or they would lose all of their share price. And, you know, maybe it's theoretically possible for some of them to do it, but they never will because it's not in there. So, okay, using less social media. I get this question a lot, and I don't feel I can tell people delete all the social media off your phone. I haven't deleted it because it has become so dominant in our world. These companies have become so successful that you really can't exist in the world today unless you're on social media. I mean, even if there are things that I like about some of the platforms, you know, I posted on Instagram today, it was nice. You can't be kind of a modern citizen without being on the platforms. So what do? I think that from an individual level, the best thing that you can do, and this is to go back to your first question, is to think of it like a drug, because that's what it is. It's addictive, it changes your behavior, it changes the way your brain works, and you know, drugs are something that are, if you think about caffeine, if you think about alcohol, if you think about nicotine, there's something that probably almost everyone in this room uses to some extent. But we know how to use it safely because we understand what it does to us. We understand our limits. We understand how much is too much. You know, I wouldn't have 2 bottles of wine and then drive a car because I know that's not safe, because I understand the effect that alcohol has on my brain and on my body, but I can still have a glass of wine at the end of the day, perfectly safe. You know, I should probably have a little bit less, but it's fine. I've got it, you know. You understand how to incorporate it into your life. And I think if you look at social media the same way and you say, okay, if I use social media for news, I'm going to be misinformed. Not just the posts will be wrong, but it will tap into my emotions in a way that will make me want to believe misinformation. It will make it very hard for me to resist it. It will make me feel very hostile towards people I would not feel hostile towards otherwise. So I'm going to be careful not to use it for news. Or maybe you understand that if I scroll Instagram too much, it makes me feel bad about myself. So I'm going to understand that effect it has on my self-image. And when you start to understand that, then it becomes at least easier to figure out, where do I want to get with how much I use social media? And this is something I did, where starting maybe 6, 7 months ago, I looked at, okay, I'm spending 4 hours a day on all of the social media apps, including TikTok. It's way too much. I want to get it down to an hour a day. And then there are tools you can use. You know, if you set your phone to grayscale, that's probably the single best thing you can do, because it removes that casino effect. It makes it so much less addictive and so much less engaging. I have a little lockbox I put my phone in at night, or I used to. I've backslid a little bit. For a while, I actually got a flip phone, which I really recommend if you can get away with it. You can get certain apps, like there's one called Opal, there's another called, I think it's 15 Seconds, that will limit your ability to use these apps. And you do this to help yourself break the addiction and to try to moderate your use of it. And that's not going to fix everything, but I think it makes it much easier to still be in the world, still be a digital citizen, still you're talking to your friends on WhatsApp, on Instagram, but not have it affect you as much.
Eu queria falar um pouco também, fazer um momento de autocrítica jornalística, né? Em algum momento, os sites também usaram alguns desses recursos viciantes para tentar maximizar as suas métricas, né? Então, assim, a indignação e tudo mais. Eu queria ver a tua experiência pessoal e qual que é a visão que você tem disso. E se você acha que a gente está caminhando para um outro momento ali, os sites continuam querendo audiência, alcance, métricas, engajamento.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So early on in the kind of social media revolution, 2012, 13, 14, I worked at a American digital news website called Vox, which is actually when I was here last time, 9 years ago. I was there to talk about Vox. And we were very...
No qual você foi diretor de conteúdo.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I was the foreign editor and also the content director. Wow, good memory. 9 years ago. Not bad. I can barely remember my title. And we thought a lot about how can we get traffic from Facebook, because we were a new website and we didn't have subscriptions. It was all advertising. So we want as many people to see the articles as possible for the business model. And also, if you're a journalist, you want people to read your work, right? You think that your work has value, it has something to contribute, you want to inform and educate people, you want to reach readers. And social media was, and is less so today, but especially then, was the best possible way to reach large numbers of people at once. And we definitely had meetings where we would talk about not necessarily what stories we were going to do, and certainly not what facts we were going to report, but we would talk about how to frame the headline in a way that it would do well on Facebook, that it would go really high on Reddit, that it would do well on Twitter. And at the time, that felt very innocent. I don't feel so good about that looking back, because some of the things that we leaned into were, of course, outrage. You won't believe what Republicans said about Barack Obama, or, Vladimir Putin did this terrible thing. And, it wasn't that we weren't like making it up. Vladimir Putin did do a terrible thing, but it was that we were leaning more into those emotions and those biases that we thought was reaching readers, but was actually just serving the Facebook algorithm, was just serving Facebook and helping them make more money. And then we just got some more readers in return. I think it's changing now for a few reasons. One is that so many outlets are moving towards a subscription model instead. And that's just healthier. You have a very different relationship with readers when it's subscription, because it's about the value you provide to them to come back, which is much more, favors more like, I'm going to give you good stories, reliable information, you can feel good about it, and less, outrage to get you to click, or, curiosity gap to get you to click. Also, the social platforms promote news much, much less. This is something that Adam Mosseri, again, who's the head of Instagram, but also sets a lot of the kind of algorithmic policies in Facebook, because he used to be the head of the Facebook algorithm, so he's the kind of big trendsetter. He has been very open about saying we are downranking news. We don't want to promote news anymore. We are going to, he won't use the word suppress, of course, but we are not going to show news to readers as much. We're going to make it harder for people to find news, because we just don't think it's worth the trouble. It's not what we want to show people. And I think that's harmful, because it means people still want to know what's happening in the world, but now instead of seeing it linked to a Voya article, what they're seeing is a misinformation rumor posted by their uncle, because they want to know about this news topic, this thing that's going on, and the algorithms are just serving them lower quality information instead. But it also means that a lot of news agencies have just been forced to reconsider, say, well, we can't chase social media the way that we used to, so we have to think about other ways to reach readers, which is destabilizing, but maybe is a good transition, because I think a lot of us were heading in that direction anyway, because we knew the social media platforms didn't share our values.
Tem dois casos na Suprema Corte Americana que podem ser julgados aí em algum momento, um no estado do Texas, outro da Flórida, que são basicamente questionamentos ao poder das plataformas de moderar conteúdo. Então, um deles diz assim, olha, vocês não podem bloquear um perfil de um político durante candidatura, ou vocês não podem remover um post pelo pensamento, pelo ponto de vista, né? E a gente teve mais recentemente com a compra do Twitter, agora o X, pelo Elon Musk, que ele declarou, olha, eu quero que isso aqui seja o mercado, a praça pública das ideias, liberdade de expressão, a gente vai parar de ter esse viés de esquerda, etc, etc. A gente viu como tem vários estudos mostrando o que aconteceu com o Twitter. Qual é o limite da liberdade de expressão na internet?
Yeah. So, I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court cases, of course, are important outside of the United States, too, because even if the companies only change their policies within the United States, that will lead them to change the kind of the ways they think about things, and those practices tend to emanate out to their other markets. I mean, there's a big school of thought among a lot of conservative judges in the United States that say that moderation should not exist. And the reason is that the issue has basically been very polarized, including, ironically, on social media. There was a injunction that was issued by, I think it was a district court judge, which is 2 steps down from the Supreme Court. You probably know better than I do. Okay.
No.
let's say 2. That was forbidding members of the federal government from even contacting the platforms to say, hey, we think we saw some misinformation on here, which the platforms were asking for. This wasn't censorship. The government wasn't saying, remove this post we don't like or we're going to fine you. They were saying, you asked us to send you if we see misinformation. We think this is it. You do whatever you want with it. And this district federal judge forbid the government from any contact from doing this. And his injunction that he wrote about it was full of social media conspiracies, which I thought was so funny. Maybe not funny. Maybe it's also pretty scary. But it just showed that he had been filled with conspiracies he had learned from social media that had radicalized against the issue. It's also very polarized because Donald Trump and the Republicans, after the 2016 election, when there was so much of a sense in the United States that the platforms had tilted things for him, or that Russian meddling had favored things for him, which I think was actually overstated. But because of that, Trump and the Republican Party generally became very outspoken, claiming that the social media platforms were censoring them and were trying to elect Democrats, which is not true. There's no evidence for that. And that led to a lot of people who are very conservative, and including judges, to think, well, we have to limit the platforms from being able to do anything at all about certain kinds of content that the platforms say is harmful. So that's not great. What was the other one that you asked about?
Era isso e o que aconteceu com o Twitter, né? O X, pós-Elon Musk. O X, liberdade de expressão.
That's right. So where are the limits of free speech? So that's the Supreme Court cases, which who knows how they were ruled, but it seems at least pretty plausible that they will limit the ability of the companies to remove political misinformation. Elon Musk he described himself as turning Twitter into a free speech platform, but that has not been the effect at all. The effect at all has been to heavily promote far-right accounts, heavily promote, including by Elon Musk personally, an enormous amount of misinformation. The platform has become incredibly hostile towards news and towards journalists, and they've made it much harder to share news links. They have, like Instagram, have changed their algorithm so that news links are suppressed now. So it's free speech in the sense that you are free to say whatever you want as long as it aligns with Elon Musk's politics, and as long as it is kind of like against the media. But what he really means by that is that he really hates the media and he really hates journalists, and he wants to use his ownership of Twitter, I think it's fair to say, to kind of humble and to hurt the media and the liberals and the people that he doesn't like, which I think he's been at least somewhat effective with. But Twitter use is so limited now relative to the other platforms. It feels very important to me because I'm on it for some reason, and a lot of journalists are on it, but not
Ainda.
that, yeah.
Ainda, porque não tem uma alternativa para essa função do Twitter, né? Nenhum conseguiu.
Right, yeah. I mean, Facebook kind of tried with Threads, but nobody wanted to use it. I mean, the replacement is YouTube, Instagram, and especially TikTok. That's where users are going, which is just the structures of those platforms don't favor the same kind of, journalists posting good information, journalists posting news links. So it's just, I think that the kind of what we know of as Twitter, the kind of short form text-based social media, I think that will be something that eventually we just lose, which is too bad because it's been very valuable.
Max, o seu livro é um livro bem avaliado entre resenhas online e também na Amazon ali tem uma média boa de estrelas, mas entre pessoas que não gostaram do livro, muitas delas dizem que você critica a questão da liberdade de expressão, e também fala assim, não, é importante ter liberdade de expressão indeterminada, tal. E também muita gente fala o seguinte, que entre as críticas negativas, que poxa, isso é um ataque à direita, são normalmente grupos de direita que acham que se sentem mais vulneráveis e mais atacadas. Você percebe isso? Você acha que esse tema é um tema que fala entre vários extremos, ele incomoda mais os grupos de extrema direita do que de extrema esquerda? Na desinformação?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, I also, when the book went up, I went to Goodreads and read all of the 1-star reviews. I don't know why I do that, but so I'm very aware of this kind of line of criticism is where that mostly showed up. So does it favor? There's a few kind of questions baked into this. One is, does it favor the extreme right more than the extreme left? What is that relationship there? The platforms will exaggerate whatever your views are. If they're right wing, if they're left wing, if you like pizza more than pasta, whatever your views are, if you spend more time on the platform, it will lead you to hold a more extreme view of that. And that is certainly true on the left as well. And that's been documented in a number of studies. But what has also been documented is that the platforms and Twitter itself actually came out and said, we looked at our platform and we found that our platform was doing this. The platforms themselves will promote the extreme right over the extreme left. And no one is exactly sure why this is, because it's the algorithm making this choice. And no one knows why the algorithm makes the choices it does, because it's self-training, right? It just processes billions of data points and then decides itself what to promote. But all of the platforms arrived at this same thing. And the theory of this that I find the most persuasive is that the things that perform best on these algorithms, the things we talked about, hate, us versus them, a sense of dividing society between one group and another. Of course, anybody with any political persuasion can believe those things, but those are views that tend to align more with the extreme right, especially when it comes to things like racial or religious minorities. So, also Donald Trump was president for the majority of the period when I was working on the book, so that was where a lot of the really damaging energy was in terms of political radicalization that was happening on social media while I was working on it. So I think people who wanted to believe that both sides are equally culpable of using social media in bad ways, or wanted to believe that it couldn't possibly be that social media is pulling people in one direction, for whatever reason they didn't like that theory, reacted against that. But there's plenty of people who are on the political right who feel the same way I do about the platforms, who are also very worried about it. So I don't think it's the case that worrying about the effects of social media makes you inherently anti-right-wing.
O que vem por aí? A gente vai ter, já estamos esquentando para mais uma eleição americana, tem eleições municipais também no Brasil no ano que vem. Queria saber o que O que você enxerga que vem por aí, agora com novos fatores, né? A inteligência artificial já está nas plataformas, mas entra numa forma generativa, criando conteúdo de vídeo, foto e tudo mais. O que você enxerga que a gente deve ficar atento, como cidadão ou como jornalista?
So with AI, I'm sure that we're going to start to see more AI-generated disinformation and fake news on the platforms very soon. We're already starting to see it. I'm less worried about that than other people because, first of all, I think you can still kind of spot it.
Ainda, né? Ainda a gente consegue diferenciar, né? O que é inteligência artificial generativa.
Exactly. Yeah, we can still differentiate. And also just what we know about the way that misinformation and disinformation works. It doesn't work on you because it's so well constructed that you're fooled by it. It works on you because it speaks to your innate prejudices. It works on it because of the way that it's presented, right? Like that study that we talked about in 2018 from you present information as a news article versus a Facebook post. What persuades you? It's not the content, it's the way that it's presented. So I think that, of course, it will matter if you see a fake video that looks incredibly real and effective. It will definitely impact more people, but I think that's not the main thing. I think what I will be looking for the most in the next year or two is understanding the impact of TikTok, because it seems like it's going to be the same that we have seen before, but exaggerated. But every platform is a little bit different, and the things that get promoted on Facebook is different than what gets promoted on YouTube, is different than what's promoted on Twitter, just because the structure of the platform is different. And that just incentivizes and cultivates different things. And I think that this will be the set of elections coming up in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years that are the most influenced by TikTok that we have ever seen, of course, because the platform is only getting bigger. But when we start to learn what effect that really has on people in an aggregate way.
Muito bem. Bom, a gente vai descer aqui, o Max vai numa banca ali do lado autografar o livro. Eu já tenho o meu aqui. A capa brasileira é bem mais bonita que a americana, tá?
I love it.
É maravilhosa mesmo.
I would never, maybe my American illustrator is watching. I love the Brazilian cover so much. It is so beautiful. It's such a cool cover. I'm very excited about it. So even if you don't want to read it, it looks cool on your shelf because it's a nice blue and red. Yeah.
Ótimo ponto. Obrigado por estar aqui pela segunda vez, o único convidado. Patrícia, muito obrigado.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, pessoal.
Hey guys.